The chill of the North Sea wind carried with it whispers of conquest, ambition, and destiny. Imagine a towering figure, battle-scarred yet unbroken, his piercing eyes fixed on horizons that stretched far beyond his homeland. This was Harald Hardrada, remembered as the last great Viking king. His story begins not with triumph, but with exile, a prince driven from his home after a crushing defeat. Yet what might have ended another man's tale became the forge of his legend. Across continents, from the glittering courts of Byzantium to the blood-soaked fields of England, Harald carved his name into history with sword, coin, and cunning. He was more than a warrior. He was a king who dared to dream of empires, a man whose restless ambition would shape not only Scandinavia but the destiny of Europe itself. His life was a saga of daring raids, fierce rivalries, and grand visions, ending in one of the most dramatic battles ever fought on English soil. To follow Harald's journey is to trace the closing arc of the Viking Age itself, the last thunderclap before the storm faded into history. His tale is both the story of a man and of an era, one that still echoes through sagas, chronicles, and the imagination of all who hear his name. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we dive into the extraordinary life of Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king. We will explore his early struggles, his years as a mercenary, his rise to the Norwegian throne, his daring ambitions, and the fateful battles that sealed his place in history. Stay with us as we uncover the legend, the man, and the shadow he left across Europe. The story of Harald Hardrada, remembered as the last great Viking king, begins in a world of turbulence, ambition, and relentless struggle. He was not born as a wanderer or a soldier of fortune. He came into the world as a prince, a younger son of a royal house that carried the weight of centuries of rule and tradition in Norway. From his first days, he was surrounded by the grandeur of lineage and the expectation of power. Yet the path before him was anything but smooth. Harald's early life unfolded in a way that few could have predicted. His story is one of exile, endurance, and transformation, a tale in which loss and hardship served as the furnace that shaped a warrior of extraordinary determination. Harald was born in the early part of the 11th century into the family of King Sigurd Syr and Queen Asta. His father was a petty king, known for his steady and pragmatic nature, while his mother had already made her mark on Norwegian history. Asta was also the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, who became King of Norway. From the beginning, Harald lived in the shadow of Olaf's ambitions and struggles, and this connection would define much of his youth. He was the half-brother of a king who sought to unify Norway under Christian rule, a task that would bring both glory and devastation to the family. Harald, though still a boy during Olaf's reign, absorbed the lessons of both power and peril. As he grew, Harald showed signs of unusual physical strength and courage. Accounts describe him as tall, broad, and striking in appearance, with piercing eyes that seemed to mark him as someone destined for greatness. Yet greatness in those years required more than lineage or presence. Norway was a land of shifting loyalties, fierce rivalries, and unending battles for the crown. Kingship was not secured by birth alone, but by the sword, by alliances, and often by ruthless force. Harald would learn this truth early, for his life was upended before he even reached manhood. The decisive turning point came when Harald was only about 15 years of age. In the year when his half-brother Olaf attempted to reclaim the throne of Norway after losing it to Knut the Great of Denmark and England, Harald stood by him. Though still young, he joined Olaf's army, determined to fight for his family's claim and for a vision of a united Norway. The climactic clash came at the Battle of Stiklestad, one of the most famous battles in Norwegian history. It was there that Olaf, the king and Harald's half-brother, was defeated and killed. For Norway, it marked the fall of a ruler who would later be revered as a saint. For Harald, it was a crushing defeat that nearly cost him his life and set him adrift from the land of his birth. The defeat at Stiklestad forced Harald into exile. He was badly wounded and had to flee. The boy who had marched into battle as a royal prince found himself an outlaw, stripped of home, family, and position. Few experiences could be more humbling. Yet it was this moment that began the transformation of Harald into something far greater than a mere claimant to a throne. Exile carried him far beyond Norway, into lands where his name was unknown and his survival depended on his own strength, skill, and daring. With little choice, Harald turned toward the east, seeking safety and opportunity. He first found refuge in Kievan Rus, a realm that connected Scandinavia with the wider world of Eastern Europe and Byzantium. The princes of Kiev often welcomed Viking exiles, and Harald found in Grand Prince Yaroslav the wise a patron who recognized his talent. Here, Harald began to fashion himself into a professional warrior. The life of a royal exile demanded service, loyalty, and above all, the ability to fight and win battles on behalf of others. In Kiev, he proved himself and gained both allies and experience that would serve him well in the years to come. But Harald's ambitions reached beyond serving in the courts of Rus. His eyes turned toward the great empire of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its immense wealth, renowned armies, and endless conflicts that promised both danger and reward. To many Norsemen, Byzantium represented the pinnacle of adventure and fortune. The emperors of Constantinople employed warriors from the north as part of their elite Varangian Guard, a corps of mercenaries famed for their loyalty and fearlessness. Harald joined their ranks, and in doing so, began the next chapter of his wandering life. In Byzantium, Harald rose quickly. His stature, skill with weapons, and commanding presence set him apart. He fought in campaigns across the empire, from the eastern frontiers against Arab foes to the distant shores of Sicily, where Byzantine armies sought to reclaim lost lands. Each battle added to his reputation. He faced dangers on land and sea, learning tactics far beyond those of the Viking homelands. The disciplined formations of Byzantine soldiers, the complex strategies of siege warfare, the intricacies of diplomacy and intrigue in the emperor's court, all of these became part of Harald's education. He absorbed the lessons of empire, learning not only how to wield a sword, but also how to navigate the politics of power. Though his service in Byzantium was marked by success, it was not without peril. The Byzantine court was notorious for suspicion, betrayal, and shifting allegiances. Even those in the elite guard could fall victim to jealousy or distrust. Harald himself found reasons to be wary, and at times he had to use his wits as much as his strength to survive. Yet he endured, building both wealth and renown. Tales would later be told of his daring exploits, of how he outmatched enemies, overcame impossible odds, and even captured cities through cunning and courage. By the time he left Byzantium, he was no longer simply an exiled prince, but a hardened commander whose name carried weight across seas and kingdoms. These mercenary years were essential to Harald's transformation. Unlike most Viking leaders, who earned fame primarily through raiding and local conquest, Harald became a professional warrior on the world stage. He fought not only for his own survival but also for pay, for honor, and for the recognition that came with victory. He saw lands and peoples that few of his countrymen could imagine. He gained riches and knowledge, and with every passing year, he grew more determined to reclaim the throne of Norway. What had begun as exile was turning into preparation. Each battle, each alliance, and each hard-won lesson sharpened him for the destiny he still believed was his. The boy who had fled from Stiklestad returned from his wanderings as a man of immense experience. He was no longer merely the half-brother of a fallen king, but a leader in his own right, tested by years of hardship and shaped by encounters with the greatest powers of the age. His path was unlike that of any Viking before him. While many had ventured far in search of plunder, few had immersed themselves so deeply in the service of foreign rulers, learning the arts of empire and bringing them back to the north. Harald did not simply survive exile. He turned it into the foundation of his greatness. The early defeat that might have ended another man's life instead marked the beginning of Harald's extraordinary journey. From a wounded boy prince on the fields of Stiklestad, he became a wandering warrior whose footsteps reached from the forests of Rus to the palaces of Constantinople. His exile gave him strength, skill, and perspective, and it set him apart as a figure destined not only to reclaim a crown, but also to leave a mark on history as the last great Viking king. When Harald left the fields of Norway after the crushing defeat at Stiklestad, he carried with him not only the wounds of battle, but also the burning conviction that his exile was temporary. In his mind, he had never abandoned the dream of returning home as a king. Yet before he could grasp that crown, he had to carve out a new life across foreign lands. His footsteps carried him into the courts of Rus, across the walls of Constantinople, and deep into the heart of campaigns that stretched over seas and continents. The boy who had once followed his half-brother into hopeless battle was gone. In his place grew a man whose very name began to inspire both fear and admiration wherever it was spoken. Harald's first refuge was the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav of Kiev, who reigned over a land that stood at the crossroads of east and west. To the Norse, Kiev was not merely a city, but a vital hub of trade, culture, and diplomacy. Rivers brought goods from the Baltic southward, connecting the cold forests of the north with the riches of Byzantium. Yaroslav was no ordinary prince. He ruled with shrewd judgment and maintained ties that extended into Scandinavia and beyond. He welcomed exiles when it suited his purpose, and Harald was no exception. In Kiev, Harald found both safety and opportunity. He was still a young man, scarcely past 15 when he first arrived, but he carried himself with the bearing of one already hardened by battle. His presence in Yaroslav's court was more than that of a mere refugee. He became part of the prince's retinue, proving his worth as both a warrior and an advisor. Harald's royal blood made him valuable, for hosting him brought prestige to Yaroslav, and Harald's ambition made him eager to serve. It was here that he learned the subtleties of court life, how alliances were forged, how loyalties shifted, and how power was maintained not only through battle, but also through marriage, negotiation, and wealth. Though his stay in Kiev was not long, it left a deep mark. Harald absorbed lessons that would serve him for decades. He also built relationships that endured, for Yaroslav became both a patron and a future father-in-law. These bonds would later prove vital when Harald returned to claim his throne. But even as he settled for a time in Kiev, Harald knew that his destiny required more than waiting. He sought both experience and fortune, and both could be found in the Empire of Byzantium. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, was the jewel of the medieval world. Its wealth, its armies, its walls, and its palaces dazzled all who approached. To men of the north, it seemed a place of endless opportunity. The emperors employed the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of warriors drawn largely from Scandinavia, famed for their loyalty and ferocity. Service in the Guard brought riches, honor, and renown. It also brought danger, for the Guard was often dispatched to the most perilous fronts. For Harald, it was exactly the path he needed. When Harald entered the service of the Byzantine emperor, he stepped into a world far removed from the fjords of Norway. The Varangian Guard was unlike any other force he had known. They were not raiders or seasonal fighters, but a professional, disciplined body of men bound by oath and reputation. Their duty was not only to fight in the emperor's wars, but also to serve as his personal protectors. To stand in their ranks was to be part of an elite fraternity, feared across the empire. Harald thrived in this environment. His size, skill, and commanding presence quickly set him apart. He was not content to be a common soldier. He sought distinction. Campaign after campaign offered him the chance. The empire's enemies were many, from Arab forces pressing in from the east to pirates on the Mediterranean seas and rebels within its provinces. Harald fought them all, traveling further than most of his countrymen ever dreamed. He fought in Sicily during campaigns to reclaim territory from the Saracens. He marched into Asia Minor, clashing with Turks and Arabs in brutal battles across rugged landscapes. He sailed the Mediterranean, quelling revolts and hunting pirates. Each theater of war added to his reputation, and with each victory, he accumulated wealth. Wealth, for Harald, was more than personal treasure. It was the currency of power, a resource he would one day use to buy loyalty and secure his throne. The gold and silver he collected in Byzantium, whether paid in wages, gifted in rewards, or seized in conquest, would later flow back into Norway as the foundation of his rule. Yet more important than wealth was the reputation he built. His name spread not only among the Varangians, but also among Byzantine commanders and princes. He became known as a fearless warrior, a man of cunning and resolve, someone who could be trusted with the most difficult tasks. In Byzantium, Harald also learned strategies far beyond the Viking style of sudden raids and bold charges. He studied siege warfare, learning how to take fortified cities with patience and skill. He observed naval operations, understanding how fleets could be deployed for more than quick raids, but for sustained campaigns. He saw the value of discipline and order in battle, of formations that held firm under pressure, of reserves that turned defeat into victory. He absorbed the lessons of empire, how power was maintained across vast lands through not only force but also diplomacy, intrigue, and spectacle. All of this he carried with him, reshaping his vision of what it meant to be a king. But service in Byzantium was not without peril. The imperial court was a place of constant suspicion, where loyalty was tested and betrayal lurked in every corner. Emperors rose and fell, conspiracies brewed, and even the Varangian Guard was not immune to intrigue. Harald himself clashed with imperial authority. Accounts speak of his imprisonment at one point, perhaps due to jealousy of his rising power or suspicion that he was growing too ambitious. Whether the details are true or embroidered over time, what is certain is that Harald faced moments where survival required not only strength of arms, but also sharp wit. He endured, and he left Byzantium alive, wealthy, and with a name greater than when he arrived. By the time Harald decided to leave the service of the empire, he was no longer a wandering exile, but a seasoned commander. He returned first to Kiev, bringing with him not only the riches he had gained, but also the prestige of one who had served the mightiest empire of the age. In Yaroslav's court, he found welcome again, this time not as a boy in need of refuge, but as a man whose fame had spread across continents. Yaroslav saw in Harald a valuable ally, one whose ambitions were no longer limited to survival, but aimed at kingship. To cement their bond, Harald married Yaroslav's daughter, Elisiv, thus binding himself to one of the most powerful families of the north. This union gave Harald more than a wife. It gave him legitimacy, alliances, and the sense of destiny fulfilled. He had been the exile who wandered the world in search of fortune, but now he stood as a prince once more, fortified by experience, wealth, and networks that spanned from Constantinople to Kiev and into Scandinavia itself. The exile who had fled Norway after a crushing defeat was now preparing to return, not as a desperate boy but as a conqueror ready to seize the throne. Harald's years in exile, in Kiev and Byzantium, had transformed him. They had turned his early loss into a foundation for greatness. The Varangian Guard had sharpened him into a blade, honed by countless battles. The court of Kiev had taught him diplomacy and given him alliances that secured his standing. He was now more than a Viking. He was a statesman, a strategist, and a leader whose name carried weight across the known world. Every step, every battle, every alliance had led him toward the moment when he would set sail for Norway once again. The long path of the wanderer was nearing its end, and the destiny of the last great Viking king was about to unfold. When Harald returned from Kiev, no longer the young exile who had limped away from Stiklestad, but a man forged in wars across 3 continents, he carried with him both the wealth of Byzantium and the confidence of one who had survived everything the world could throw at him. He had wandered far, fought countless battles, commanded men under emperors, and married into the household of Yaroslav the Wise. Now his eyes turned back toward the fjords and valleys of Norway. For all his victories abroad, his true destiny still lay there. He believed that the crown of Norway was not only his right by birth, but his reward for endurance. With Byzantine gold in his coffers and hard-won experience in his mind, he prepared to reclaim what had once seemed lost forever. The Norway he returned to was not the same as the one he had left as a boy. His half-brother Olaf, though slain at Stiklestad, had been sanctified in the years after his death. His martyrdom had transformed him from a defeated king into a saint, and this gave Harald's claim to the throne a sacred weight. Yet Norway was still fractured, contested by rival chiefs and influenced by the powerful king of Denmark, Svein Estridsson. Harald knew that he could not simply arrive and declare himself ruler. He needed strategy, alliances, and force, and in each of these he was prepared. His first step was to secure allies. Harald did not return alone. He gathered around him men who had served with him abroad, warriors hardened in the Varangian Guard, men who had seen the might of Byzantium and were loyal to him personally. These were not inexperienced raiders, but disciplined soldiers with years of campaigning behind them. They carried with them not only their weapons, but also the promise of gold, for Harald's wealth allowed him to reward loyalty generously. Where others had to beg or threaten, Harald could pay. This gave him an edge in a land where shifting loyalties often depended on the promise of spoils. Yet Harald knew that even with his following and his wealth, he could not simply claim the throne by force. He first allied with his nephew Magnus, the son of Olaf, who had already become king of Norway. At first, Magnus and Harald ruled jointly, an uneasy partnership that reflected both pragmatism and rivalry. Harald could not hope to overthrow Magnus outright, for Magnus held legitimacy as the son of Saint Olaf, yet Magnus could not ignore the power and experience of Harald. Their arrangement was fragile, but it gave Harald the foothold he needed to re-establish himself in Norway. Fate soon removed the obstacle. Magnus died suddenly while still young, leaving Harald as the undisputed king of Norway. To Harald, it was both an opportunity and a challenge. The crown was now his, but holding it would prove more difficult than seizing it. The chieftains of Norway were fiercely independent, and the looming shadow of Denmark threatened constantly to undermine his authority. Harald did not flinch. He had not endured years of exile, and war only to rule half a kingdom. He set about consolidating his power with the same relentless drive that had carried him through Byzantium and Kiev. His rule was marked by both brilliance and brutality. Harald was no gentle king. He demanded obedience, and he enforced it through force when persuasion failed. Those who resisted him often met with fire and sword. He imposed his authority on the scattered regions of Norway, uniting them under his command more firmly than they had been in generations. Yet his methods earned him as much fear as loyalty. To his followers, he was a leader of vision, wealth, and strength. To his enemies, he was a tyrant whose will could not be bent. Harald's ambitions did not stop with Norway. He looked across the sea to Denmark, where King Sweyn Estridsson ruled. The rivalry between Harald and Sweyn became one of the defining struggles of the age. Both men were ambitious, proud, and unwilling to yield. To Harald, Denmark represented not only a rival kingdom, but also the fulfillment of his vision of dominance in Scandinavia. He believed that by uniting Norway and Denmark under his rule, he could secure a legacy equal to or greater than that of Knut the Great, who had once ruled over a northern empire stretching from England to Denmark and Norway. For years, Harald launched campaigns against Sweyn. These were not minor raids but large-scale invasions, fought with fleets of longships and armies of seasoned warriors. The seas between Norway and Denmark became a constant battlefield. Villages burned, towns were plundered, and countless men were slain in the struggle. Sometimes Harald gained the upper hand, driving deep into Danish lands and forcing Sweyn to retreat. At other times, Sweyn's forces repelled him, proving that the Danish king was no easy foe. The struggle dragged on, year after year, with neither man able to deliver the final blow. This rivalry shaped Harald's reign. It consumed resources, demanded constant vigilance, and defined his foreign policy. Yet it also revealed the depth of his ambition. He was not content merely to hold Norway. He sought to dominate all of Scandinavia. His vision was of a northern kingdom that could rival the great powers of Europe, a legacy that would endure for centuries. To achieve it, he was willing to wage endless war, to exhaust his people, and to risk everything. His determination was unyielding, and though he did not conquer Denmark, his campaigns etched his name into the memory of both nations. Even within Norway, Harald's rule was not uncontested. The independence of the local chieftains, the resistance of regions long accustomed to autonomy, and the ever-present influence of the church all posed challenges. Yet Harald navigated these with a mixture of force, wealth, and cunning. He rewarded those who supported him, crushed those who defied him, and bound the kingdom more tightly under royal authority than it had been before. His reign brought stability at a cost, for the peace he imposed was born of fear as much as loyalty. Harald's legacy as King of Norway was forged in this crucible of constant struggle. He was not a ruler who sought compromise or gentle persuasion. He was a warrior king, shaped by exile, hardened in Byzantium, and driven by an ambition that would not yield. His return to Norway marked not the end of his wanderings, but the beginning of a new chapter, one in which his vision of kingship extended beyond his homeland into the whole of Scandinavia. His rivalry with Sweyn Estridsson embodied this vision, a clash of titans that defined the era and left both kingdoms scarred but remembered. What set Harald apart was not merely his victories or his failures, but the relentless force of his will. He had risen from the ashes of defeat at Stiklestad, wandered through foreign courts, fought in lands far beyond the imagination of his countrymen, and returned to seize a throne. Few men could have endured such a journey, and fewer still could have turned it into triumph. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, did not rule with gentleness or mercy, but he ruled with a power that none could ignore. His reign was a testament to unyielding drive, to the belief that destiny was not given but seized, no matter the cost. By the time Harald Hardrada had forced his will upon Norway and locked himself in endless rivalry with King Sweyn of Denmark, his ambitions stretched far beyond the battlefield. He was not only a warrior hardened by decades of exile and mercenary service, he had also become a ruler who understood that swords alone could not hold a kingdom together. If his reign was to last, if his dream of a greater northern realm was to become more than a vision, he needed to transform Norway from a patchwork of competing chieftains and fragile alliances into a kingdom bound not only by loyalty, but also by shared prosperity. This realization turned his gaze toward reforms that were unusual for a Viking ruler, reforms that revealed the imprint of his years in Byzantium and Kiev, where power was inseparable from wealth, and where strong states thrived on systems far more stable than plunder alone. Harald began to consolidate his rule not simply through conquest, but through the structures of governance and economy. Among his most notable innovations was the introduction of standardized coinage across his realm. Norway until then had relied heavily on barter and on foreign coins, particularly silver from England and the German lands. Local chieftains and merchants often struck their own marks, and trade was messy, inconsistent, and easily disrupted. Harald, having witnessed the orderly coinage systems of Byzantium and the markets of Kiev, understood that currency was more than a tool of commerce. It was a symbol of authority, a visible sign that power flowed from the king. To stamp one's face or mark on coins was to declare sovereignty, and to require their use was to bind the people into the economic order of the crown. Thus Harald set about issuing coins that bore his own likeness and symbols of his reign. These coins were not only practical, but deeply political. They proclaimed that Harald was no longer just another warlord among many, but the sole authority who controlled the wealth of the kingdom. Trade within Norway began to take on a new character, for merchants could now deal with predictable values, and taxes could be gathered in uniform currency rather than in an inconsistent mix of silver, goods, and livestock. This marked a shift from the older Viking world, which had thrived on raids and spoils, to a more stable economy that resembled the ordered systems of Europe's more centralized monarchies. Coinage was only one part of Harald's economic vision. He sought to extend his control over trade routes, fortifying harbors and ensuring that markets paid dues directly to the crown. The rivers and fjords of Norway had long been lifelines for commerce, but under Harald they became arteries of royal wealth. He imposed tolls, standardized measures, and ensured that disputes were settled under royal law rather than local custom. In doing so, he weakened the independence of the chieftains and strengthened the crown's direct influence over daily life. Trade was no longer just the domain of local lords. It was under the watchful eye of the king. This economic consolidation was not without resistance. Norway's chiefs had grown used to autonomy, to collecting their own dues and enriching themselves without oversight. Harald's insistence on uniform coinage and centralized trade struck at the heart of their power. Yet Harald was unrelenting. Just as he had burned villages that resisted his military rule, he used force when necessary to enforce his economic reforms. Where persuasion and wealth could not sway loyalty, violence did. Over time, resistance gave way to reluctant acceptance, for Harald's system brought benefits even to those who had fought it. Markets flourished under the stability he imposed, merchants grew wealthier under consistent trade conditions, and the kingdom began to enjoy prosperity that raiding alone could never provide. The reforms also gave Harald leverage in his rivalry with Denmark. While his campaigns against Svein Estridsson often drained resources, his economic base allowed him to recover more quickly than his rivals. The revenues from coinage, tolls, and standardized taxes allowed him to sustain fleets and armies year after year, where other rulers might have faltered. Harald could reward his followers not only with loot from campaigns, but with steady payments from his treasury, a practice that reflected his Varangian years when soldiers expected wages as much as spoils. This made his loyalty network unusually strong. The influence of Byzantium can be seen clearly in these measures. Harald had witnessed firsthand how emperors used coinage not only to pay armies, but to project their image across lands and centuries. A Byzantine gold coin was recognized across Europe and the Near East, carrying with it the authority of empire. Harald could not hope to match such grandeur, but he could imitate it in his own way. His silver coins tied Norway to a wider economic world, for they could be exchanged in foreign ports and accepted in trade with distant lands. Norway, once a peripheral land of raiders and farmers, was becoming a participant in a larger European economy. This transformation extended beyond economics into the very structure of the kingdom. By centralizing wealth and standardizing systems, Harald strengthened the monarchy itself. Kingship was no longer dependent only on charisma or victory in battle. It became an institution backed by the machinery of finance and trade. In this, Harald set the foundation for a more enduring monarchy, one that could survive the death of a single king and continue to wield authority through established systems. It was an achievement as significant as any battle he fought, though less remembered in the sagas that favored tales of blood and glory. Harald's consolidation of power also reshaped society. Farmers and craftsmen, once tied primarily to local lords, now found themselves part of a kingdom that reached into their daily transactions. Taxes paid in coin, tolls collected on goods, disputes judged under royal authority. Each of these reminded them that they were subjects not just of a local chief, but of a king who ruled from the center. This fostered a new sense of identity, fragile but growing, of belonging to a kingdom larger than one's village or region. It was a step toward the idea of a nation, though centuries would pass before such a concept fully formed. The prosperity that followed gave Harald greater room to pursue his ambitions abroad. With Norway more stable and wealthier than it had been in generations, he could direct attention once more toward Denmark and even further afield. His economic base did not dull his warrior spirit, it sharpened it, providing him with the resources to sustain wars of greater scale. To Harald, the reforms were never an end in themselves, but a means to fuel greater conquests. The wealth of Byzantium had taught him that power flowed from stable foundations, and he sought to replicate that truth in the north. The legacy of these reforms outlasted Harald himself. Even after his death, the coinage he introduced continued to circulate, a tangible reminder of his authority and a symbol of how far Norway had come under his rule. Where once the kingdom had been fractured and reliant on plunder, it had become a state with an economy capable of sustaining armies, fleets, and ambitious kings. This was Harald's quieter conquest, one that received fewer songs from the skalds, but shaped the destiny of the land as profoundly as his victories in war. For Harald, the consolidation of his kingdom through coinage and commerce was not a departure from his warrior identity, but its necessary complement. He had fought his way across the world and returned with lessons learned in the courts of emperors. Those lessons told him that glory won in battle faded unless it was underpinned by structures that endured. By stamping his mark on silver, by binding his people into a common system of trade and taxation, he ensured that his reign rested on more than the fleeting loyalty of warriors. It rested on the daily life of his people, on every transaction, every toll, every piece of silver that carried his name. Thus the wanderer who had fled Stiklestad, the mercenary who had fought under the banners of Byzantium, and the conqueror who had battled Sweyn of Denmark revealed another side of his greatness. The reformer who gave his kingdom stability. His ambition was not only to be remembered as a fearsome warrior, but as a ruler whose vision shaped the destiny of Norway, and by extension, the north of Europe. In this, he succeeded, for the economic foundations he laid allowed his kingdom to stand firmer than it had before, and it gave him the means to continue reaching for an empire that could rival the greatest of his age. The reforms that Harald Hardrada had set in motion within Norway marked more than stability and prosperity for his people. They also marked the completion of one stage in his long journey and the beginning of another. The coins that bore his likeness, the tolls that filled his coffers, the markets that thrived under royal oversight, all of these strengthened him not only as a monarch of Norway, but as a ruler who now possessed the material base to dream beyond his own shores. For a man forged in exile and driven by unyielding ambition, such prosperity was never an end in itself. It was a foundation, a platform upon which he could pursue the grandest vision of all, the conquest of England. To Harald, England was not merely another realm to raid or rival to challenge. It was the ultimate prize, the crown jewel of northern ambition, a land rich in resources, fertile in soil, and already shaped by a history of Viking presence. England had been part of the North Sea world for generations, woven into the lives of Scandinavians through trade, settlement, and conquest. The Danelaw in eastern England still echoed with the legacy of Viking rule, and the memory of Knut the Great loomed large over all the north. Knut, a Dane, had united Denmark, Norway, and England into one great northern empire. His death had left that empire fragmented, but the memory of it lingered in the imagination of rulers who followed. For Harald, who had already fought for supremacy in Norway and Denmark, England represented both continuity with this legacy and its ultimate fulfillment. His years in Byzantium had taught him the meaning of empire. His years in Norway had shown him how fragile authority could be if it was not extended and defended. England, with its wealth and its strategic position across the North Sea, could transform his kingship into something larger than a Scandinavian struggle. It could place him on a stage that rivaled the greatest monarchs of Europe. It was not enough to rule Norway, nor even to outmatch Sweyn Estridsson in Denmark. To truly be remembered, Harald had to stretch his reach into England, to wear the crown that had once rested on Knut's brow, to complete the vision of a northern empire. The opportunity came through an unlikely figure, one whose fate had been intertwined with the shifting politics of England, Tostig Godwin's son. Tostig was the brother of Harald Godwin's son, the powerful earl who would soon ascend to the English throne. But while Harald thrived in English politics, Tostig had fallen into exile. Driven out of his earldom by rebellion and resentment, he nursed bitterness and sought a path back to power. It was in his desperation that he turned to Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, whose reputation for ambition and conquest had already spread far and wide. The meeting of these two men, one an exiled English earl, the other a restless Viking king, would set in motion events that altered the course of history. Tostig saw in Harald the instrument of his revenge and his return. Harald saw in Tostig a key to unlocking the gates of England. Tostig knew the lay of the land, the weaknesses of English politics, the rivalries that fractured the nobility, the vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He promised Harald not only his allegiance but also intelligence, guidance, and the chance to find English allies who might rise against Harald Godwin's son. For a man like Harald, already seeking justification for his invasion, Tostig's approach was like a spark to dry tinder. Yet Harald's claim to England was not based on opportunism alone. He had already begun to weave a narrative that justified his ambition. According to his reasoning, the English crown had been promised to him by King Harthacnut, the son of Nut, who had died without an heir. Though the legitimacy of this claim was dubious at best, it was enough for Harald, who had never shied from bending the truth to suit his ends. Combined with Tostig's support, it gave him both the pretense of legality and the practical means of action. The wealth of Norway, the loyalty of seasoned warriors who had followed him from Byzantium to Denmark, and the guidance of an English insider. All these formed the foundation of his plan to invade England. The scale of the ambition cannot be overstated. To launch such an invasion required vast resources. Fleets had to be built, armies mustered, supplies gathered. The North Sea crossing was perilous even in calm seasons, and to carry thousands of warriors across its waters demanded careful planning. Harald, however, was no stranger to such challenges. His years of campaigning with the Varangian Guard had accustomed him to large-scale expeditions, and his wealth from both Byzantium and Norway gave him the means. He set about preparing one of the largest Viking invasions ever attempted, assembling ships and men from across his kingdom and beyond. Tostig, meanwhile, played his part by stirring dissent in England. Though he could no longer command loyalty as he once had, he sought to rally discontented nobles and to spread word that Harald's coming was not merely an invasion, but a chance to reshape English rule. Some listened, some ignored him, but his presence added an element of unpredictability to the political situation. Harald Godwin's son, his brother, could not dismiss the threat, and this division weakened the English position at a time when unity was most needed. For Harald, the invasion of England was the culmination of everything he had endured since his youth. The exile who had fled from Stiklestad, the mercenary who had served in Kiev and Byzantium, the conqueror who had bent Norway to his will. He now sought to crown his life with the greatest prize of all. Every battle he had fought, every reform he had imposed, every coin he had minted seemed to lead to this moment. He believed that destiny itself was guiding him toward England, that the dream of empire was finally within reach. The sagas tell us that Harald set out with a fleet numbering more than 200 ships, carrying warriors hardened by years of warfare. Whether this figure is exact or inflated, what matters is the scale. It was an army vast enough to terrify and awe, a force that rivaled the great expeditions of the past. As the fleet cut across the waters of the North Sea, it carried not only swords and shields, but also the weight of Harald's ambition. The men who rowed those ships believed they were part of an undertaking that would be remembered for generations. To them, Harald was not only their king but their path to wealth, glory, and renown. The invasion began with success. Harald and Tostig landed in northern England and quickly demonstrated their might. Towns fell, tribute was gathered, and fear spread among the English. Harald, always eager to display both cunning and ruthlessness, offered terms of submission that promised protection to those who yielded and destruction to those who resisted. Many chose submission. In these early days, it seemed as if Harald's gamble might succeed. His army grew stronger as victories mounted, and his reputation as an unstoppable force spread through the land. Yet ambition, no matter how vast, often blinds men to the dangers that lie ahead. Harald's invasion was bold, but it was also precarious. England was not Byzantium, where wars could be waged over years across vast territories. It was an island kingdom, where speed and timing mattered. Harald Godwin's son, the rightful king, was not idle. He gathered his forces, marched north with astonishing swiftness, and prepared to meet the invader. What followed would determine not only the fate of Harald Hardrada, but also the destiny of England itself. The partnership with Tostig, which had once seemed Harold's advantage, also revealed itself to be a weakness. Tostig's bitterness had blinded him to the strength of his brother, and his counsel may have lulled Harald into underestimating the resistance he would face. Tostig wanted revenge more than strategy, and while Harald valued his intelligence, he may have been misled into believing that England was more divided than it truly was. In truth, when threatened by a foreign invader, many English rallied to Harald Godwin's son, uniting behind him with a determination that caught Harald off guard. In those final months, Harold's vision of empire, his grand ambition that had carried him from Norway to Byzantium and back, came into sharp focus. He was closer than ever to the prize he sought, yet also closer than ever to disaster. His fleet, his men, his wealth, and his alliance with Tostig had brought him to the shores of England. But now he would have to test all of it against the resolve of a kingdom that would not yield so easily. When Harald Hardrada resolved to bring his lifelong ambition into reality and strike for the crown of England, he did not approach the task as a reckless adventurer chasing plunder. He approached it as a king who had learned the value of preparation, of wealth, and of projecting strength through scale. His entire reign had been shaped by the lessons of exile, the discipline of the Varangian Guard, the ruthless consolidation of Norway, and the endless rivalry with Denmark. All of these experiences prepared him for what he believed would be the final and greatest campaign of his life. The invasion of England was to be nothing less than the defining stroke of destiny, a gamble so vast that it would either elevate him into the ranks of the most legendary monarchs or cut short his life at its very height. To make such a gamble credible, Harald needed more than boldness. He needed a fleet and an invasion force of a scale not seen since the peak of Viking power. The sagas speak of more than 200 ships setting out from Norway, rowed and sailed by thousands of men. Some accounts claim even more, though such figures are difficult to verify. What is certain is that the force Harald assembled dwarfed the usual raiding parties that had harried England in earlier generations. This was not a band of opportunists, but a royal army, composed of seasoned warriors who had fought under Harald across Scandinavia and beyond. Many were veterans of his campaigns against Sweyn Estridsson in Denmark. Others had served with him in Byzantium, carrying scars and skills from wars in Sicily, the Mediterranean, and Asia Minor. They were not only numerous but hardened, loyal, and accustomed to discipline as much as ferocity. To face them was to face the distilled might of the Viking Age at its very end. The ships themselves reflected the ambition of the enterprise. Longships built for war, sleek and fast, were joined by larger vessels capable of carrying supplies and horses. The coordination of such a fleet required resources far beyond what ordinary raiding bands could muster. Harald's coinage reforms and his control of trade in Norway now bore fruit, for he could finance the building, equipping, and sustaining of such a massive expedition. Supplies of food, weapons, and armor had to be gathered and loaded. The oarsmen needed provisions for the long voyage across the North Sea. Arms had to be maintained, shields painted, spears sharpened. Everything pointed to the seriousness of the campaign. Harald was not sending men to raid. He was sending them to conquer. When the fleet gathered, it was a sight to inspire awe. The sight of hundreds of dragon-prowed ships, stretched along the fjords of Norway, must have impressed even those who had seen fleets before. Warriors crowded the decks, their mail coats glinting in the sunlight, their weapons ready, their banners fluttering in the wind. Skalds would later describe how the oars churned the waters like the wings of a great bird, how the sea seemed to tremble under the weight of the ships. For the men aboard, there was no mistaking the scale of what they were part of. They were not sailing for a mere raid, but for a conquest that could alter the balance of power in Europe. Harald himself presided over this force with the authority of a man who had earned loyalty through both generosity and terror. He had been paying his men with the silver minted under his rule, rewarding service not only with plunder, but with wages that echoed the practices of the Varangian Guard. He had shown them the rewards of loyalty, and now he promised them the greatest reward of all, the riches of England, a land famed for its fertile fields, wealthy towns, and thriving trade. To follow Harald across the sea was to gamble on glory, but it was also to trust that their king, seasoned by decades of war, knew what he was doing. As the fleet launched into the waters of the North Sea, the very scale of the enterprise carried meaning. It signaled to the English and to all of Europe that this was no fleeting raid, but a serious bid for kingship. The size of the invasion force, in itself, was a weapon. News of its departure spread quickly, sowing fear and uncertainty. England had faced Viking attacks for centuries, but never before had such a formidable and organized host sailed from Norway with the express aim of conquering the entire kingdom. It was the last great flood of the Viking tide, a force that recalled the glory days of Nut, and in the minds of Harald's men, promised to renew them. Yet this scale also carried immense risks. A fleet so vast was difficult to maneuver, vulnerable to storms, and heavily dependent on supplies. Harald's logistical skills, honed in the complex campaigns of Byzantium, were tested as never before. He had to ensure coordination across hundreds of vessels, to prevent ships from becoming scattered or lost, and to maintain discipline among thousands of men drawn from different regions and traditions. The gamble was not only military but logistical. If he failed to land his force intact, his dream would collapse before it began. Despite these risks, the fleet reached the shores of England and landed with dramatic effect. It was the last time such a host would cross the sea under the banner of a Viking king. The landings themselves were conducted with precision, and the force quickly demonstrated its strength by subduing local resistance and forcing towns to submit. The English who saw the fleet arrive must have felt a shock that bordered on despair. To watch ship after ship draw into the shore, to see thousands of armed men disembark with banners and mail coats, was to witness the embodiment of a threat long feared, but never before realized at such scale. Harald understood the symbolic weight of this display. He wanted the English to see his force, and to grasp immediately that resistance was futile. In his mind, the very appearance of his fleet was meant to break morale and compel surrender. It was a strategy rooted in his Varangian experience, where displays of overwhelming power often opened the gates of cities before a single blow was struck. But England was not Byzantium, and its people, when pressed, would prove far more resilient than Harald imagined. The fleet, however, remains one of the most significant elements of Harald's story. It was the last great Viking army to land on English shores, the final grand act of a tradition that had begun centuries earlier with raids on monasteries and coastal villages. From Lindisfarne to the Danelaw, England had lived under the shadow of the Northmen for generations. With Harald's invasion, that shadow reached its deepest and darkest point, only to vanish forever in the aftermath. The gamble he made with his fleet and his invasion force symbolized not only his own ambition, but the closing of an entire era. The Viking Age, defined by ships, raids, and conquest, was about to end, and Harald's fleet was both its climax and its swan song. For Harald himself, the fleet was more than an army. It was his statement to the world. He had taken his wealth, his reforms, his experience, and his ambition, and he had transformed them into a force that could not be ignored. Every ship carried not only men and weapons, but also the memory of his journey from exile to king, from wanderer to conqueror. The fleet was the embodiment of his destiny, the vessel through which he hoped to seize England and write his name alongside Nut as master of the northern seas. Yet as the prows cut into English waters and the banners flew, the gamble he made became clear. Either England would fall, and his legend would be secured for all time, or the fleet that symbolized the height of his ambition would become the tomb of his dream. The scale of the invasion magnified both the promise of victory and the risk of annihilation. This was Harald Hardrada's character distilled into a single act: audacious, relentless, unwilling to settle for less than everything, and prepared to risk it all for the crown that had eluded him for so long. The fleet that Harald Hardrada brought across the North Sea had landed with thunder, its arrival shaking northern England. Villages submitted, towns gave tribute, and the reputation of the Norwegian king spread quickly among those who had heard of his campaigns in Byzantium and his victories in Scandinavia. The sheer scale of his force gave the impression that resistance would be futile. For Harald, this was the culmination of his lifelong dream. The moment when England seemed within his grasp, when the prize that had eluded so many others could finally be won. It was a moment of triumph and inevitability, as if destiny itself had chosen him to complete the work begun by Nut the Great. But the English were not idle. In the south, Harold Godwin's son, newly crowned after the death of Edward the Confessor, knew the danger posed by Hardrada's landing. He was already bracing for an expected invasion by William of Normandy, but the sudden arrival of the Norwegian fleet in the north demanded immediate attention. If left unchecked, Hardrada could gain a foothold that would fracture the kingdom from within. For the English king, there was no choice but to march north with speed, leaving the threat of Normandy for later. This set in motion one of the most remarkable and grueling marches in English history, and one that would bring Harald Godwinson face to face with the last great Viking king. Before Harald arrived, however, Harald Hardrada would have his moment of triumph. The English earls of the north, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, gathered their forces to confront the invader. Their task was to defend their lands and to hold off Hardrada until the king himself could respond. On the 20th of September in the year 1066, the two armies met at a place called Fulford, near the city of York. Here, the fate of northern England would be decided, and Harald Hardrada would demonstrate once again the tactical brilliance and ruthless ferocity that had defined his life. The battlefield at Fulford lay near the River Ouse, with marshy ground constraining movement on one side. The English earls positioned their men defensively, attempting to use the terrain to their advantage, hoping to block the Norwegian advance. But Harald, seasoned by decades of warfare from Sicily to Denmark, understood how to exploit ground and momentum. He arranged his forces in depth, placing his best men at the front and keeping reserves ready to exploit weaknesses. The presence of Tostig Godwinson, fighting at his side, also added weight to his cause, as Tostig sought to reclaim the lands and honor he had lost. The battle opened with ferocity. Shield walls clashed, spears thrust, swords hacked through armor and flesh. The English fought bravely, determined to defend their homes and their city. For a time, they held the line, their shield wall standing firm against the pressure of the Norwegians. But Harald, towering in height and strength, pressed forward with relentless energy. Accounts describe him as almost superhuman in the thick of battle, cutting down foes with his great sword and rallying his men with his voice. The discipline of his army, many of whom were veterans of Byzantium, began to tell. They pressed the English back step by step, grinding down their resistance. At a critical moment, Harald ordered a maneuver that turned the tide. His men wheeled around the marshy flank, forcing the English into a vulnerable position. Caught between the Norwegians and the difficult ground, the English shield wall began to break. Once the cohesion of their formation was lost, the slaughter began. Men fled toward the river, only to drown as they tried to escape. Others were cut down where they stood. The earls themselves managed to survive, but their forces were shattered. The victory at Fulford was total. Harald Hardrada had crushed the defenders of the north and stood triumphant before York. The city soon surrendered, offering hostages and tribute to the invader. For Harald, this must have felt like confirmation of destiny. He had crossed the sea with a massive fleet, defeated the forces of the north in open battle, and compelled one of England's greatest cities to yield. From exile as a boy, he had risen through every trial to stand now on the threshold of empire. Few could have imagined, in that moment, that disaster lay so close at hand. While Harald basked in his triumph, Harald Godwinson was marching north with astonishing speed. Leaving the south exposed to the looming Norman threat, he gathered his Huscarls and the Fyrd and drove them on a forced march that covered hundreds of miles in less than a week. The pace was brutal, yet the determination of the English king and his men carried them forward. Their very lives and the fate of their kingdom depended on reaching Harald Hardrada before he could consolidate his hold on York. By the time Harald Godwinson approached the north, Harald Hardrada was unprepared for what awaited him. Having secured York's surrender, he believed the region pacified and saw no immediate threat. Many of his men were dispersed, gathering supplies or resting after the battle. His army, though victorious, was not assembled in full strength. Confident of his position, Harald marched eastward to Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September to receive hostages and oversee the submission of the region. It was here, on this seemingly calm day, that Harald Godwinson struck with sudden and devastating effect. The English king and his army fell upon the Norwegians with stunning speed. For Harald Hardrada, the shock was total. He had not expected Harald to arrive so swiftly, nor with such a large and determined force. Many of his men were caught without armor, having left their mail shirts behind in the heat of the day. The Norwegians scrambled to form a shield wall, rallying around their king as the English pressed the attack. What followed was one of the most dramatic and desperate battles of the age. Stamford Bridge became the crucible in which the fate of the Viking Age itself would be decided. Harald Hardrada, undaunted even in surprise, took his place at the front of his men. Tall, broad, and fierce, he wielded his sword with both hands, striking down foe after foe. The The sagas say he cut through the English ranks like a whirlwind, his sheer presence terrifying to behold. For a time, it seemed as though his courage might turn the tide, as his men rallied to his side and the shield wall held. Yet the odds were against him. The English were fresh, numerous, and determined, while the Norwegians were weary and unprepared. As the battle raged, Harald pushed too far forward in the chaos. An arrow struck him in the throat, piercing his windpipe. The great king, who had survived exile, Byzantine intrigue, countless wars, and battles across half the known world, fell to the ground. His men fought desperately to retrieve his body, and for a time Tostig attempted to rally them. But with Harald's death, the spirit of the army faltered. The fighting continued for hours, with both sides showing incredible valor. One saga recounts the story of a single Norwegian holding the narrow bridge against countless Englishmen, cutting them down until he was finally slain from beneath. Such moments testified to the ferocity of Harald's warriors, but bravery could not outweigh exhaustion and numbers. By the end of the day, the Norwegian army was annihilated. Of the hundreds of ships that had carried them across the sea, only a handful were needed to carry the survivors home. The death of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge was more than the fall of a king. It was the symbolic end of the Viking Age. For centuries, Scandinavians had raided, conquered, and settled across Europe, their longships striking terror wherever they went. Harald's invasion was the last great flood of that tide, the last attempt to carve out a Viking empire through sheer force. His defeat marked the close of that era, ushering in a new age in which the great powers of Europe would no longer live in fear of sudden raids from the north. For Harald himself, his end was both tragic and fitting. He had lived his life in pursuit of greatness, refusing to settle for safety or compromise. From the moment he fled into exile as a teenager, he had sought glory in every corner of the world. He had fought in Kiev, Byzantium, Sicily, Denmark, and Norway. He had amassed wealth, commanded armies, and ruled as a king. Yet always his gaze had been fixed on something greater, something beyond his reach. England had been that dream, the crown that would elevate him beyond even Nut. He had gambled everything to seize it, and in the end, the gamble consumed him. The battlefield at Stamford Bridge became his tomb, a place where the legend of the last great Viking king ended in blood and iron. His fall cleared the way for Harald Godwinson to march south, only to meet his own fate weeks later at Hastings against William of Normandy. In this way, Harald Hardrada's death shaped not only the end of the Viking Age, but also the beginning of a new chapter in English history. The Normans, themselves descendants of Viking settlers, would succeed where Hardrada had failed, conquering England and remaking its destiny. And yet Harald's memory endured. The skalds sang of him as the thunderbolt of the north, the man who never shrank from danger, who dared everything for glory. To his followers, his fall at Stamford Bridge was not defeat, but the ultimate proof of his courage. He had died as he had lived, with his sword in hand, in the front rank of his men, facing overwhelming odds without fear. Few kings could claim such an end, and fewer still could command such lasting respect even in death. Thus the fields of Fulford and Stamford Bridge stand as twin symbols of his last campaign. Fulford, the triumph that seemed to promise destiny, and Stamford Bridge, the catastrophe that brought it all crashing down. Together, they mark the final act of the Viking saga, a story that had begun with raids on monasteries centuries earlier and ended with the death of the last great Viking king beneath the English sun. When the shield walls finally broke at Stamford Bridge and Harald Hardrada's body fell upon the grass of that autumn field, the air was filled not only with the cries of battle, but with the sound of something ending. For those who had followed him from Norway across the North Sea, the shock of his death was crushing. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was reduced to fragments, its ships burned or abandoned, its survivors limping back to the coast. Where once hundreds of vessels had carried them proudly, now only a pitiful remnant sailed home, bearing the news that the great king had fallen. Yet the consequences of that battle did not end with the destruction of his host. Harold's defeat sent tremors through England and across Europe, shaping the fate of nations in ways even he could never have foreseen. The first and most direct consequence was exhaustion. Harald Godwinson had won a brilliant victory, but the cost was immense. His army had marched hundreds of miles in blistering time to surprise the Norwegians, had fought ferociously through the long day at Stamford Bridge, and had endured casualties that weakened his strength. The English were bloodied, drained, and far from home when new word came. William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. What had begun as a triumph for Harald was now revealed as a trap laid by fate itself. To defeat Harald Hardrada in the north only to face William the Conqueror in the south was more than any one king should have been forced to endure. Yet it was the price England paid for being caught between two claimants in the same autumn of 1066. It is one of history's starkest ironies that Harald, in failing to conquer England, paved the way for William's success. Had Hardrada not landed, Harold Godwinson might have held his army fresh and intact to meet the Normans. Instead, he was forced into a cycle of desperate marches and battles, racing from one end of his kingdom to the other. The fatigue of the long journey north and back south, the wounds from Stamford Bridge, the depletion of numbers, all of these played into William's hands. Thus Harold, though slain in battle, shaped the outcome of Hastings weeks later. His invasion weakened the shield that stood between England and Normandy, ensuring that William's gamble succeeded where Harold's had failed. From this perspective, Harald Hardrada's campaign was more than his own final adventure. It was the spark that set in motion one of the greatest transformations in English history. The Norman conquest reshaped law, language, culture, and governance for centuries to come. Yet behind William's victory lay the shadow of Harold's ambition. The man who had dreamed of uniting Norway, Denmark, and England in a northern empire may not have lived to see it, but his actions helped open the way for another conqueror to seize the prize. In this sense, Harold's ghost lingered over Hastings as surely as his body had fallen at Stamford Bridge. For Norway, the news of his death was devastating. Harold had ruled with an iron hand, enforcing order, minting coins, and shaping the kingdom into something more unified than it had been before him. Though he often provoked resentment with his severity, there was no denying his strength as a monarch. His fall created uncertainty, yet it also left behind a structure that endured. His reforms in trade, coinage, and governance provided stability, while his reputation as a mighty warrior gave Norway a place of pride in the imagination of its people. Even in death, he loomed as a standard against which later rulers would be measured. The sagas did not let him fade. To the poets and chroniclers of the North, Harold was a figure too dramatic to be left in silence. They sang of his youth at Stiklestad, his exile, his years in Byzantium, his wealth, and his return to claim a throne. They told of his cunning, his ruthlessness, and his daring. They described Fulford as triumph, Stamford Bridge as tragedy, and his life as a story of ceaseless striving. To call him the last great Viking king was not to deny the kings who came after, but to recognize in him the final embodiment of that restless spirit which had defined the age. With his death, the Viking Age closed not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap, a last storm before the calm of a new Europe. Harold's legacy, however, is not simple. He was no romantic hero. He could be brutal, merciless, and driven by ambition that cared little for the cost in lives. His campaigns in Denmark left fields ruined and villages burned. His rule in Norway was marked by heavy-handed methods, crushing opposition with severity. He was feared as much as loved, respected more than adored. And yet, it was precisely this blend of qualities that made him unforgettable. He was not a king content to sit on a throne and rule quietly. He was a king who lived like the warriors he led, who demanded greatness of himself and of others, who pursued visions so vast that failure itself seemed almost as grand as success. In Europe, his impact was felt beyond Norway and England. His service in Byzantium left traces in the memory of the empire, where the Varangian Guard remained legendary for centuries. His marriage ties to Kiev and his connections in Rus broadened the reach of his influence. His rivalry with Denmark shaped Scandinavian politics long after his death. And in England, though he failed to win the crown, his invasion became part of the chain of events that altered the destiny of the island. In this way, Harold's shadow stretched across the whole of northern Europe, linking east and west, north and south, through a life that never ceased to push outward. Why does he endure so powerfully in the modern imagination? Partly it is the drama of his life. A prince exiled as a teenager, a mercenary in the service of emperors, a king who clawed his way to power, and finally a conqueror who died in the attempt to seize the ultimate prize. It is a story that reads like legend even when grounded in history. But it is also the qualities he embodied: restless ambition, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, the refusal to accept limits, that resonate today. He stands as a symbol of the Viking spirit, that combination of exploration, violence, and daring that transformed Europe in the early medieval centuries. In sagas and histories, Harold appears larger than life, towering not only in physical stature, but in imagination. His fall at Stamford Bridge is remembered not simply as defeat, but as the kind of end suited to a saga hero, dramatic, tragic, and etched forever into memory. To this day, when people speak of the last Viking king, it is his name that comes to their lips. His legend bridges the gap between myth and reality, between the poetry of the skalds and the annals of chroniclers. In modern times, Harald's story continues to captivate because it sits at the intersection of endings and beginnings. He marks the close of the Viking Age, yet his death directly influenced the rise of the Normans, themselves descendants of Viking settlers in France. He is both the end of one era and the doorway to another. His defeat is not merely the failure of a king, but the moment when one chapter of history gave way to a new order that would shape medieval Europe. There is also something deeply human in his story. For all his power and ruthlessness, he was driven by the same hunger for greatness that has inspired and doomed leaders throughout history. His ambition lifted him from exile to kingship, but it also blinded him to the risks that brought about his death. He achieved much, yet always sought more. He unified Norway, yet longed for England. He won battles across continents, yet was undone in one final clash. This tension between achievement and yearning, between success and overreach, gives his story a tragic beauty that continues to speak across the centuries. To walk the fields of Stamford Bridge today is to feel that shadow. The land is quiet now, the river flows gently, and the villages nearby go about their lives in peace. But in the mind's eye, one can still see the shield walls clashing, hear the cries of warriors, and imagine the tall figure of Harald Hardrada striding into the fray. His bones lie elsewhere, but his presence lingers in the stories told of that day. The grass has grown over the battlefield, but history has never erased the memory of the last great Viking king who fell there. Harald Hardrada's life can be seen as a mirror of the Viking Age itself. Born in fire and exile, shaped by journeys across the known world, marked by violence, ambition, and discovery, and finally brought to an end by the emergence of a new political order. He was the product of his age, but he was also its culmination. When he fell, the age of raiders and sea kings fell with him, giving way to kingdoms and empires that built on what the Vikings had begun. His story is both individual and symbolic, both personal and epical. And so his shadow endures, not only in the sagas of the North or the chronicles of England, but in the imagination of all who hear of him. He is remembered as brutal, yes, but also as brilliant, feared but also admired, defeated but never forgotten. His life reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who succeed, but also by those who dare greatly and fall. In daring everything, Harald Hardrada left behind a legacy that no crown could have secured more firmly. He became a legend, and in legend, he achieved the immortality he sought in life.